It is one of the most haunting melodies in the history of American folk music. A rolling, repetitive 6/8 time signature that mimics the rise and fall of a heavy swell. A guitar riff that sounds like the wind howling through rigging. When Gordon Lightfoot wrote The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1976, he wasn't just writing a hit record. He was writing a tombstone. He was crafting a 6-minute eulogy for 29 men who vanished into the freezing darkness of Lake Superior. But a song, no matter how beautiful, is not a police report. It is poetry. And poetry has the luxury of mystery. The reality of what happened on November 10th, 1975, is far colder, far sharper, and far more terrifying than any lyric can capture. This is the story of the machine behind the music. This is the investigation into the mechanical failure, the corporate pressure, and the gales of November that conspired to snap the largest ship on the Great Lakes in half. We all know the legend. Now let's look at the truth. Gordon Lightfoot calls her a bone to be chewed. It is a violent image, suggesting something disposable, something destined to be consumed. But before the Edmund Fitzgerald was a wreck, and before she was a legend, she was a queen. And to understand the tragedy of her death, you first have to understand the sheer, overwhelming majesty of her life. In the late 1950s, the Great Lakes shipping industry was in the midst of a Cold War arms race. It wasn't about missiles, it was about steel. The post-war American economy was booming. The auto plants in Detroit, the appliance factories in Ohio, the skyscrapers rising in Chicago, they all possessed an insatiable hunger for iron ore. The Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company saw an opportunity. They decided to build the ultimate delivery vehicle. They didn't just want a ship, they wanted a statement. They contracted the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, to construct the largest vessel to ever sail the freshwater seas. When the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was laid down in 1957, she was a marvel of mid-century engineering. At 729 feet long and 75 feet wide, she was nearly the size of an aircraft carrier. She was the first maximum laker, built to the absolute limit of what could fit through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie. In fact, she was so big that the St. Lawrence Seaway had to be expanded just to accommodate the class of giants she inaugurated. She was powered by a massive Westinghouse steam turbine engine that produced 7,500 horsepower, turning a propeller that was 20 feet in diameter. When she was running at full steam, she could hit 16 miles per hour, a speed that, for a bulk freighter, was akin to a sprint. She wasn't just big, she was fast. She quickly earned the nickname the Toledo Express because she could outrun almost anything on the lakes. But she was also known by another name, the Cadillac of the Lakes. Life on board a freighter is usually Spartan. Steel bunks, cramped galleys, and the smell of diesel. But the Fitzgerald was different. She was fitted with luxurious guest quarters, deep pile carpeting, tiled bathrooms, and a galley that rivaled high-end restaurants. Company executives and clients would fight for the chance to ride along on a voyage. To be on the Fitzgerald was to be royalty. However, for the sailors who knew maritime superstition, the Fitzgerald was marked from the very beginning. Her launch on June 7, 1958, was a spectacle attended by 15,000 people. But when Elizabeth Fitzgerald, the wife of the company chairman, swung the champagne bottle to christen the ship, it didn't break. She swung again. It bounced off the steel hull with a hollow clang. It took a third, desperate swing to finally shatter the glass. In nautical lore, a bottle that fails to break is a dire omen. It is a sign that the sea does not accept the ship. As if to confirm the bad juju, when the massive ship slid sideways into the launching basin, She hit the water with such violence that she created a massive tidal wave. The water crashed over the pier, soaking the dignitaries and sending spectators running for their lives. One man in the crowd suffered a heart attack and died on the spot. The Edmund Fitzgerald had claimed her first life before she had even hauled her first ton of ore. Despite this rocky start, she performed flawlessly for 17 years. She was a workhorse. She set haulage record after haulage record, moving over 1 million tons of ore in a single season. She was the gold standard. She was invincible. Or so it seemed. By November 1975, the Queen of the Lakes was showing her age. She had battle scars. She had scraped bottom in 1969. She had collided with a lock wall in 1970. In 1974, she had lost her bow anchor on a trip near the Detroit River. She was a tired ship, ridden hard by corporate demands. And she had a design flaw, one that was celebrated as a feature by the accountants, but feared by the engineers. It was her freeboard. Freeboard is the distance from the water's surface to the main deck. It is the ship's reserve buoyancy. It is the margin of error. When the Fitzgerald was launched, regulations allowed for a certain amount of freeboard. But over the years, the shipping companies lobbied the Coast Guard to allow them to load the ships deeper. Deeper draft meant more cargo. More cargo meant more profit. The Coast Guard acquiesced. In 1969, and again in 1973, the load lines were adjusted. The Fitzgerald was allowed to sit lower and lower in the water. By 1975, her safety margin had been shaved down, inch by lucrative inch. On the afternoon of November 9, 1975, the Fitzgerald lay berthed at the Burlington Northern Railroad Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. It was a routine Sunday. The weather was deceptive, unseasonably warm, hazy, with a temperature hovering near 50 degrees. It was the Indian summer Gordon Lightfoot immortalized in his opening verse. High above the deck, in the pilot house, stood Captain Ernest McSorley. McSorley was the archetype of a Great Lakes skipper. At 63 years old, he had spent 44 years on the water. He was a quiet, solitary man who rarely spoke unless it was necessary. He didn't drink, but he smoked constant cigarettes. He was known as a heavy weather captain, a man who didn't flinch when the gales blew. He had the respect of his crew, but he was also known for pushing his command. He ran a tight ship, and he kept a tight schedule. This voyage was significant for McSorley. He was tired. He had told his friends and his wife that this would be his final season. He was looking forward to retirement, to sleeping in a bed that didn't pitch and roll. He just had to get through a few more runs before the lakes froze over for the winter. Below him, the loading chutes were roaring. The cargo was taconite. To the layman, iron ore is just rocks. But taconite is a specific processed form of iron. It is ground into powder, mixed with clay, and rolled into marble-sized pellets, which are then baked hard. These pellets are dense, heavy, and shifting. They pour like liquid when loading, but they settle like lead. 26,116 tons of these pellets were pouring into the Fitzgerald's cargo holds. It was a massive load. Not an illegal one, but a heavy one. As the cargo poured in, the ship settled lower and lower. The water crept up the hull markings. When the chutes were finally retracted and the hatches clamped down, the massive 729-foot ship had only about 11 feet of steel showing above the water. Think about that. A ship longer than 2 football fields, weighing as much as an aircraft carrier, riding with its deck just a few feet above the surface. If the waves were to reach 12 feet, a common occurrence on Lake Superior, the deck would be submerged. The crew would be walking on a submarine. At 2:15 p.m., the engines rumbled to life. The deep, resonant bass of the ship's whistle echoed off the hills of Wisconsin. The lines were cast off. Captain McSorley guided the massive vessel out of the harbor and into the open expanse of Lake Superior. He was joined by another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, captained by Bernie Cooper. The Anderson was smaller and slower, but the two captains agreed to sail in tandem. They would be partners for the crossing. As they turned their bows toward the northeast, aiming for Sault Ste. Marie, the weather maps were already changing. Far to the west, over the plains of Kansas, a low-pressure system was forming. At the same time, a cold front was sweeping down from the Arctic. These two atmospheric giants were on a collision course. They were destined to meet directly over Lake Superior. The sailors knew a storm was coming, but they had seen storms before. They were in the largest ship ever built. They had a veteran captain. They had radar. They had power. They felt the invincible confidence of men who had tamed nature with steel. They didn't know that the barometer was about to drop faster than it ever had in recorded history. They didn't know that the gales of November weren't just coming early. They were coming with a fury that would turn the Edmund Fitzgerald from a queen into a tomb. As the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson pushed out into the dark, churning expanse of Lake Superior, they were sailing directly into the stanza that defines the song. Gordon Lightfoot wrote, "The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound, and a wave broke over the railing." To the casual listener, tattletale sound is just a poetic phrase, but to a sailor, it is a specific, terrifying frequency. The wires Lightfoot refers to are the steel stay cables and radio antennas strung between the pilot house and the aft stack. When wind hits 40 or 50 miles per hour, those wires vibrate. They hum. But when the wind crosses 60 or 70 miles per hour, hurricane force, the hum turns into a scream. It is a high-pitched, vibrating shriek that resonates through the steel of the hull. It is the ship itself warning you that the atmosphere has turned violent. On the afternoon of November 10th, the Fitzgerald was screaming. The trap had snapped shut just as the meteorological charts predicted, but with a ferocity that defied the forecasts. The low-pressure system didn't just pass over them, it deepened explosively. The wind shifted from the northeast to the northwest. This shift is crucial, and it's the key to understanding the Witch of November lyric. A northwest wind on Lake Superior has the fetch, the uninterrupted distance of open water, to build waves for hundreds of miles before they slam into the ships. By 2 p.m., the waves were no longer the rhythmic swells of a folk song. They were confusing, chaotic mountains of gray water, building to 20, then 25 feet. The Fitzgerald and the Anderson abandoned the shipping lanes. They headed north, hugging the Canadian shore, trying to use the land as a shield. But the wind shift stripped that shield away. They were exposed. Inside the ship, the reality was becoming grim, and here, Lightfoot gives us one of the most vivid characters in the ballad. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck with a sayin', "Fellas, it's too rough to feed ya." This isn't just a rhyme. There was a real cook on the Edmund Fitzgerald. His name was Robert Rafferty. He was 62 years old, a temporary steward filling in for a sick crew member. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had written a letter to his wife just days before, joking about the rough weather. Lightfoot's lyric paints a picture of a grizzled mariner coming topside to talk to the crew. In reality, During a storm of this magnitude, coming on deck would have been suicide. The deck was awash with freezing water. The cook likely used the ship's intercom or the phone system to deliver the bad news to the pilot house. But the sentiment was historically accurate. In a storm where a 700-foot ship is rolling 30 degrees to one side, the galley becomes a dangerous place. Heavy pots turn into missiles. Boiling water becomes a weapon. Rafferty couldn't cook. The crew, battered and exhausted, would have to face the storm on empty stomachs. At 3:30 p.m., the situation escalated from rough to critical. And this is where the song's narrative of a sudden disaster clashes with the slow-motion horror of the timeline. Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson. His voice was calm, but his words were chilling. "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list." Let's decode that for a moment. A list is a permanent lean to one side. It means water has entered the hull and isn't leaving. For a ship loaded heavy with taconite, a list is a death sentence in slow motion. It eats away at that precious 11 feet of freeboard. But the vents McSorley mentioned are the smoking gun. These were mushroom-shaped air intakes on the deck. If they were sheared off by debris or waves, it meant there were open holes on the deck. Holes leading directly into the ballast tanks. Every time a wave crashed over the ship, and they were crashing constantly now, thousands of gallons of water were pouring into the Fitzgerald's gut. The ship was getting heavier. She was getting slower. McSorley added, "I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?" Checking down meant throttling back the massive steam turbine. The Fitzgerald, the Toledo Express, the fastest ship on the lakes, was now limping. She had lost her radar antennae to the wind. She was blind, she was listing, and she was asking for a chaperone. Captain Bernie Cooper on the Anderson, trailing 10 miles behind, agreed to close the gap. He watched the radar blip of the Fitzgerald ahead of him. He watched as the snow began to fall harder, turning the world into a blinding white sheet. A room that has been cleaned, as the song describes the emptiness later. By late afternoon, the sun had vanished. The witch of November was in full frenzy. The wind was gusting to 86 miles per hour. The waves were reaching 35 feet, the height of a 3-story building. The crew of the Fitzgerald wasn't singing a folk song. They were fighting for their lives in a deafening, vibrating steel box. They were listening to the groan of the hull plates. They were watching the inclinometer, the gauge that shows the tilt of the ship, lean further and further to the starboard side. They were professional sailors. They trusted their captain. They trusted their machine. But as the darkness of 7 p.m. approached, the machine was failing, and the lake was preparing a final triple blow that no lyricist could invent. By 7 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald had entered the stanza of the song that brings the most debate and the most dread. Gordon Lightfoot sings, "At 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in. He said, 'Fellas, it's been good to know you.'" It is a cinematic moment in the ballad, a final spoken farewell from a doomed captain to his crew. But this is where the song drifts into mythology. In reality, there was no farewell. There was no Hollywood speech. There was only the professional, terrified silence of men doing their jobs until the very last second. To understand the end, we have to look through the eyes of the only witnesses left, the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson, trailing 9 miles behind. Captain Bernie Cooper was gripping the rail in his pilot house. The storm had evolved into something monstrous. He wasn't just fighting wind anymore. He was fighting rogue geography. On Lake Superior, there is a phenomenon known as the Three Sisters. It is a rhythmic anomaly where three rogue waves, significantly larger than the surrounding sea state, hit in rapid succession. The first wave floods the deck. Before the water can drain, the second wave hits, adding more weight. And then, while the ship is staggering, heavy, and submerged, the third wave delivers the knockout blow. At roughly 7 p.m., the Three Sisters found the Anderson. Cooper watched in horror as two waves taller than the pilot house rolled up from the stern. They buried his ship. The Anderson is a massive vessel, but she was submerged under 12 feet of water. The waves smashed into the lifeboat davits, which sat 35 feet above the waterline. For a moment, Cooper thought his own ship was lost. The Anderson shuddered, groaned, and slowly shook off the water, rising back to the surface like a whale gasping for air. But as Cooper wiped the sweat from his forehead, his thoughts immediately turned to the Fitzgerald. The Fitzgerald was 9 miles ahead. The waves that had just battered the Anderson were moving at 25 miles per hour. They were racing through the dark, closing the distance on the wounded Queen, and the Fitzgerald was in no condition to fight them. She was already listing. She had lost her radar. She was listing to starboard. She was sitting so low that the waves were likely rolling effectively along her entire deck length. At 7:10 p.m., the first mate of the Anderson, Morgan Clark, keyed the radio microphone. He wanted to warn the Fitzgerald about a target on the radar, an upbound salty, ocean-going vessel that was heading their way. In the blinding snow, with no radar of his own, McSorley was flying blind. "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Have you checked down?" Captain McSorley's voice came back over the speakers. It wasn't the voice of a man saying, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." It wasn't the voice of a man panicking. It was the voice of a technician. "We are holding our own," McSorley said. It is the most famous sentence in Great Lakes history. We are holding our own. But what did he mean? Was it bravado? Was he trying to keep morale up? Or did he genuinely believe they were going to make it? They were only 14 miles from Whitefish Bay. They were an hour away from safety. They could probably see the glow of the lighthouse on the horizon through the breaks in the snow. We are holding our own. Those were the last words ever transmitted by the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. 10 minutes later, the song's prophecy of the hatchway caving in likely met the reality of physics. Lightfoot's lyric suggests a structural failure from above, a hatch collapsing under the weight of water. And while that is possible, the violence of the disappearance suggests something far more catastrophic. At 7:15 p.m., the Three Sisters caught the Fitzgerald. Imagine the physics. The ship is 729 feet long. She is heavy with 26,000 tons of ore. She is already nose-heavy because of the water leaking into her forward tanks. The first massive wave lifts her stern high into the air. This drives her bow down, deep down, into the trough of the wave. She drives into the wall of water ahead of her. Because she is so heavy, and because she has lost her reserve buoyancy, she doesn't rise. She keeps going down. The propeller, still turning at full revolutions, is now high in the air, driving the ship downward like a torpedo. She didn't sink. She plowed. On the bridge of the Anderson, the snow squall cleared for a brief second. First Mate Clark looked at the radar screen. The green sweep line went around. It showed the shore. It showed the upbound vessels. But at the spot where the Fitzgerald should have been, 9 miles ahead, there was nothing. He blinked. He adjusted the gain. He swept the range. Nothing. He looked out the window into the black night. There were no running lights. There was no silhouette. "Captain," he said, his voice tight, "I've lost the Fitzgerald." Captain Cooper grabbed the radio mic. "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Over." Static. The hiss of the storm. "Edmund Fitzgerald, come in. Over." Static. There was no mayday. There was no alarm. The ship hadn't just sunk. It had been erased. Gordon Lightfoot wrote, "The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times, for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. But in that moment, at 7:20 p.m. on November 10th, there were no bells. There was only the confused, terrifying silence of a radio channel that had gone dead. The pride of the American side had seemingly sailed straight to the bottom of the lake, without even having the time to flip a switch. The silence on the bridge of the Arthur M. Anderson was absolute. It was a silence louder than the gale screaming outside. Captain Bernie Cooper was staring at a radar screen that had become a ghost town. He was facing a moral and nautical impossibility. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life on the water, that the Fitzgerald was gone. But to prove it, to go back and look for survivors, he had to do something that bordered on suicide. He had to turn his own ship around. To the layman, turning a ship sounds simple. You turn the wheel. But in a hurricane-force gale, with waves running 30 feet high, turning a 700-foot freighter broadside to the weather is the most dangerous maneuver a captain can attempt. If you get caught in the trough, the valley between two massive waves, while you are sideways, the next wave hits you with the force of a collapsing building. It can roll the ship over in seconds. Cooper didn't hesitate. He keyed the radio to the Coast Guard. "I am going to turn around and look for them." He waited for a lull in the waves, a momentary pause in the violence. Then he shouted the order, "Hard to port!" The Anderson swung. The hull groaned. As she came broadside to the gale, the ship rolled violently. Everything not bolted down in the galley, the cabins and the pilot house went flying. The inclinometer buried the needle. For a few terrifying seconds, the crew of the Anderson held their breath, wondering if they were about to join the Fitzgerald. Then the bow came around. They were heading back into the teeth of the storm. Gordon Lightfoot wrote, "The searchers all say they'd have made Whitefish Bay if they'd put 15 more miles behind her." It is a line filled with regret, but the searchers that night weren't safe in a bay. They were out there fighting the same monster. Cooper wasn't alone. Another ship, the William Clay Ford, anchored safely in Whitefish Bay, heard the Coast Guard's call. The captain of the Ford, a man named Don Erickson, lifted his anchor and sailed out of safety and back into hell to help search. It was an act of brotherhood that defies logic. At 8 p.m., the Anderson arrived at the last known coordinates of the Edmund Fitzgerald. They turned on their searchlights. The beams cut through the blinding snow, illuminating patches of black, heaving water. They expected to see a hull. They expected to see flares. They expected to see lifeboats. The Fitzgerald carried 2 massive steel lifeboats, capable of holding the entire crew. There was no ship. There were no boats. There was only debris. In the churning soup of the storm, they spotted the flotsam of a destroyed life. Oars, pieces of cork insulation, a propane cylinder, and life jackets, dozens of them, bobbing empty in the swell. This was the grim evidence that confirmed the speed of the disaster. The life jackets were not worn. They were floating free. This meant the crew hadn't even had time to put them on. The Fitzgerald hadn't slowly succumbed to the waves. She had been executed. The water temperature that night was roughly 35 degrees Fahrenheit. In water that cold, a human being loses consciousness in under 15 minutes. Death follows shortly after. But there were no bodies. Not one. This brings us to the most chilling lyric in Lightfoot's ballad, and a fact of Lake Superior that is scientifically, terrifyingly true. Lightfoot sings, "The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy." This isn't just folklore, it is biology. In most oceans, when a body sinks, bacteria in the gut produce gas during decomposition. This gas causes the body to bloat and eventually float back to the surface. It is a grim but natural cycle. But Lake Superior is different. It is an inland deep freeze. The water at the bottom stays a constant 39 degrees year-round. It is so cold that it inhibits the growth of the bacteria that cause bloating. The bodies don't fill with gas. Instead, the fatty tissues undergo a process called adipocere formation. They turn into a soap-like substance. The bodies don't float. They stay down. The 29 men of the Edmund Fitzgerald were not lost in the traditional sense. They were entombed. The Coast Guard report later concluded that the ship plummeted to the bottom so fast, bow first, engine running, that she hit the lake floor with the force of a missile. The impact was so violent that the ship snapped in two. The bow section, nearly 300 feet long, sits upright in the mud, proud and defiant. The stern section, carrying the engines and the accommodation block where the crew likely was, flipped over and lies upside down a few hundred feet away. Between them lies a massive field of taconite ore, spilled across the lake bottom like gravel on a driveway. Back on shore, the news was breaking. In the Mariners' Church in Detroit, the Reverend Richard Ingalls heard the report. He walked to the bell tower. Lightfoot wrote, "The church bell chimed till it rang 29 times, for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald." This moment became the emotional anchor of the song. It transformed a shipping accident into a national wake. But out on the lake, the wind was still howling. The searchers, exhausted and traumatized, turned their ships back toward the safety of Whitefish Bay. They left the Queen of the Lakes in 530 feet of water. The mystery of how she sank was over, but the mystery of why was just beginning. The storm eventually blew itself out, but the turbulence surrounding the Edmund Fitzgerald was just beginning. In the months following the tragedy, the U.S. Coast Guard convened a Marine Board of Inquiry. They reviewed the underwater footage, they interviewed the survivors of the Anderson, and they crunched the numbers. In 1977, they released their official report. It was a document that sparked a firestorm of anger that burns in the Great Lakes community to this day. The Coast Guard concluded that the primary cause of the sinking was ineffective hatch closures. They argued that the crew of the Fitzgerald had failed to clamp down the massive steel covers tightly enough. They theorized that throughout the day, as waves washed over the deck, water leaked into the cargo holds, not in a sudden torrent, but in a steady, fatal trickle. They argued the ship lost buoyancy gradually until she simply dove under a wave and didn't come back up. To the families of the lost men and to the seasoned captains of the Great Lakes, this finding was an insult. It blamed the dead. It suggested that 29 experienced mariners, led by a meticulous captain like Ernest McSorley, had been negligent in the most basic duty of seamanship. The Lake Carriers Association vehemently rejected the report. They pointed to a different culprit, the charts. They argued that the Fitzgerald had passed dangerously close to 6 Mile Shoal near Caribou Island. They theorized that in the trough of the massive waves, the ship had bottomed out, smashing her hull against an uncharted underwater mountain. This would have cracked the frame from the bottom up, breaking the ship's back long before she sank. This debate, structure versus crew negligence, became central to the legacy of the ship. And it deeply affected the man who had made the ship famous. Gordon Lightfoot had written The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald in a burst of creative energy right after the event, basing his lyrics on the early news reports. That is why the original recording contains the line, "At 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in." But as Lightfoot met the families of the victims, and as he learned about the controversy, he realized that his lyric was inadvertently supporting the theory that blamed the crew. He realized that a song can become history, and he didn't want his history to be an accusation. In a move that showed immense class, Lightfoot changed the lyrics in his live performances. He stopped singing about the hatchway caving in. Instead, he sang, "At 7 p.m. it grew dark, it was then," he said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." Later, he would change it even further to suggest the structural failure theory. At 7 p.m., it grew dark. It was then, the ship was dark and rent in twain. He understood that for the widows and the children of the 29, this wasn't just a Billboard hit. It was a vindication. The final chapter of The Physical Ship was written in 1995. A diving expedition, led by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, descended 530 feet into the darkness. They weren't looking for treasure. They were looking for a soul. Using a specialized atmospheric diving suit called the Newt suit, a diver cut the ship's bronze bell from the roof of the pilot house. It was a delicate operation. The bell was the voice of the ship. It was the sound the men heard every 4 hours during their watch changes. When the bell broke the surface of the water, it was the first time a piece of the Edmund Fitzgerald had seen the sun in 20 years. It was restored and polished. Today, it sits in the museum at Whitefish Point, but they didn't leave the wreck silent. In a solemn ceremony, the divers replaced the original bell with a replica, engraved with the names of the 29 men. It was mounted on the wreck, a permanent gravestone at the bottom of the world. And that brings us back to the music. Without Gordon Lightfoot, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald would likely be just another entry in the long, sad list of Great Lakes shipwrecks. There have been over 6,000 ships lost in these waters. Most are forgotten. But because of that haunting guitar riff, that tattletale sound of the wind in the wires, the Fitzgerald survives. The song does exactly what folk music is supposed to do. It transforms a tragedy into a monument. It reminds us that behind the industrial statistics, behind the tonnage and the profits, there are men. Men who cook dinner. Men who play cards. Men who love their sons and kiss their wives goodbye before stepping onto a steel deck. When you hear that song on the radio, you aren't just listening to a hit from 1976. You are attending a funeral. You are bearing witness to the power of the lake and the fragility of the men who try to tame it. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead, but thanks to the song, she can never erase them either. This is the history hiding inside your headphones, the tragedies that became anthems. If you want to keep exploring the true stories behind the greatest songs of our lifetime, hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell for the 29. We'll see you in the next video.